Everybody thinks post-World War II America is a simple story. We won the war, rebuilt the world, and became the good guys. But here's the part almost nobody talks about. America had a very specific peace blueprint under FDR. And after he died, we kept parts of it. But we changed the mission, some would say. Welcome back to Aaron's Smoke Break, where we kind of dive into a little bit of reality with history and see how we ended up here. Franklin Delano Roosevelt didn't just want to defeat Hitler. He wanted to defeat the conditions that create global wars, economic collapse, trade strangulation, imperial choke points, and closed seas that force nations into conflict. His plan? Open trade, stable currency, collective security of sea lanes. Break old colonial empires through finance, not conquest. Rebuild former enemies instead of humiliating them. Noble and self-serving. Also, as American companies and industrial might would lead the way, but noble nonetheless here. All right? Not arguing this. The U.S. didn't just fight in the war. We rebuilt Germany, Japan. We're rebuilding Iraq still. Like we are. Two former enemies, though, are now economic powerhouses with stable, prosperous populations. That wasn't Soviet-style domination. That was integration. If we followed parts of FDR's vision, what changed? Because April 12th, 1945, FDR dies. And within a few years, the tone shifts. Crazy hard here. The mission pivots from build a world where prosperity prevents war to contain the enemy through permanent security posture. So let's be very, 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 very clear here. Stalin was not a misunderstood reformer. The Holodomor, forced collectivization, Soviet repression, Ukraine's resistance today isn't random. It is rooted in historical trauma. America absolutely became the counterweight to Soviet expansion. I'm not arguing it, but here's the issue. Instead of letting our system speak for itself, free speech, open debate, the right to challenge authority, open markets, we increasingly frame the fight as ideological confrontation backed by military muscle. I'm not saying we shouldn't have a strong military. We should. But FDR's model leaned heavier on economics, reconstruction, and integration. Truman's era institutionalized containment, intelligence agencies, permanent defense structure, and the early foundations of what Eisenhower would later call the military-industrial complex. America didn't just win World War II. We decided what kind of world would replace it. And somewhere between economic integration and ideological containment, the mission shifted. That's today's Aaron Smoke Break. Light it up and let's break it down. World War II did not surprise Franklin Roosevelt. Pearl Harbor shocked American public, but it did not shock the White House. By the late 1930s, anyone paying attention could see the system cracking. Germany had rearmed, Italy had invaded Ethiopia, Japan had been at war in China since 1937. The League of Nations had failed. The Great Depression had fractured global trade. And Roosevelt understood something most Americans didn't want to admit. Isolation wouldn't have saved us. The writing was on the wall. After World War I, the United States retreated inward. We rejected the League of Nations. We passed neutrality acts. We avoided European entanglements. But global economics doesn't respect isolation. By 1939, Germany invades Poland. Britain and France declare war. Roosevelt publicly promises neutrality, but privately, he knows neutrality in a global industrial war is temporary. The U.S. economy intertwined with global trade. If Britain falls, Atlantic trade collapses. If Japan dominates, Asia-Pacific trade collapses. This isn't ideology. It is a geopolitical reality. Our own way of recovering from the Great Depression relies on trade. We are still in recovery mode here. Japan, oil, and China. Here's the reality of the situation most people gloss over. Japan had been fighting a brutal war in China since 1937. The U.S. initially maintained trade relations with Japan, including oil exports. But by 1940 to 1941, Japan had expanded into French Indochina. The concern in Washington wasn't just China. It was Southeast Asia's resources. Rubber, tin, and especially oil. Resources that feed modern economies in recovery mode. From the Great Depression, I would make the argument Roosevelt knew we couldn't keep up with the socialism and had to have open trade after the war. Knowing that American industrial dominance would prevail from a competition standpoint. Let me know what you think in the comments. That's just my opinion. Dang chicken. In 1941, after Japan occupied southern Indochina, the U.S. froze Japanese assets. They were committing atrocities at this point. Then came the chess move. The United States cut off oil exports to Japan. And here's the reality of the situation. No bullshit. Japan imported roughly 80% of its oil from the United States. This was not a minor sanction. This was a strategic choke point. Japan was an oil-hungry war machine, and you just took away its source of fuel. From a Japanese perspective, you just got backed into a corner, and the chess move here is American policy. Policymakers knew it. Either withdraw from China and Southeast Asia or secure oil by force. Some officials absolutely understood this increased risk of war. But from Washington's perspective, allowing Japan to dominate Asia unchecked meant surrendering the Pacific balance of power. So the oil embargo wasn't an accident. It was pressure. A country the U.S. brought in as an equal, forcefully brought in, mind you. We did forcefully make them come into an open market, but they came into an open market and were highly successful with it, despite the lack of its own resources. Meanwhile, in the Atlantic, while tensions rose in the Pacific, Roosevelt was already maneuvering in the Atlantic. The Destroyers for Base Agreement in 1940 traded aging U.S. destroyers to Britain in exchange for Atlantic naval bases. Start chipping away at that empire. Then came Lend-Lease, 1941, effectively allowing the U.S. to supply Britain and later the Soviet Union without formally entering the war. Welcome to Debt Strap Empire. Roosevelt called America the arsenal of democracy. Sounds pretty ideological. Like someone carrying a rhetoric to psychologically prepare the American people for what was to come. Nobody said being a leader of a vast and diverse nation was an easy task. All of the politicians in the Senate and Congress, they are all elected to represent a region. The president represents all. Take that in for a moment. U.S. naval patrols were escorting convoys in the Atlantic before Pearl Harbor. German U-boats were already skirmishing with American ships. Official neutrality, unofficial preparation. Domestic politics. Not everyone agreed. It's important to understand America was divided. The America First Committee opposed intervention. America has strong roots in isolationism and its culture. It's still here today. They come in the form of that we need to mind our own business crowd. Charles Lindbergh openly argued against entering the war. Many Americans still felt burned by World War I. Keep in mind, we went and helped tip the favor of the entire war into Britain and France's favor, and were completely left out of the peace negotiations. We supplied them, and our opinion didn't matter to them. Only our blood and material did. Roosevelt walked a tight rope. He had to prepare the country industrially and militarily without triggering public backlash before the country was ready. And that's where leadership comes in. He expanded shipbuilding, increased aircraft production, strengthened the Navy position, the U.S. economy for mobilization. He didn't stumble into readiness. He built it. The local National Guard unit I served in was mobilized before the start of the war. It was enshrined in my unit's history. That is quietly preparing a secret chess move that will play a bigger part later. And to touch on it, I was in the National Guard for a while. I won't get into specifics, but if you recognize anything from the images I showed you, by all means, call me out in the comments. December 7th, 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, America unified overnight, but Japan's leadership knew something too. The oil clock was ticking. Their strategic calculation was brutal. Knock out the U.S. Pacific Fleet, secure Southeast Asian oil fields, and fortify before America could respond. It was a gamble, and it failed. The key takeaway isn't that FDR wanted war. It's that he understood the global system was collapsing, and he positioned America to survive it. Does this sound familiar to anyone? And more importantly, he was already thinking about what the peace would look like. Because for Roosevelt, winning the war wasn't enough. The question was, how do you build a world where you don't have to fight the next one? He wanted to prevent a world where America would get dragged into someone else's war again. That's where we go next. Open trade, baby. Before we talk about FDR dismantling empires, we need to be perfectly honest about something here. America has never been empire-free. If we're going to have an adult conversation, logical one, about post-war power, we don't get to pretend the United States was some pure anti-imperial saint. Because we weren't. America's imperial phase in 1898, after the Spanish-American War, the United States acquired the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico. Hawaii had just been annexed before that, in 1898, after the overthrow of its monarchy by American business interests. The Philippines, they became a colony. And when Filipino revolutionaries resisted U.S. control, the Philippine-American War followed. It was brutal, and thousands died. So let's not rewrite history here. By all means, there's more America has done. Comment away. But America stepped into the imperial game. We held overseas territories. We projected naval power. Our army may have been in shambles, but our Navy, we always kept funded. Don't touch our fucking boats. Even when America is poor, we care about our Navy. It keeps trade routes open, and we control trade routes. That is empire behavior. European empires were extractive systems. They controlled colonies for resource extraction, Britain, labor exploitation, and Belgium trade privilege. Colonial markets were locked inside imperial trade blocks. The empire benefited, the colony served. Now compare that to what happened after World War II. The United States did not annex Germany. We did not colonize Japan. We occupied them, yes, but we rebuilt them. We invested in infrastructure, and here's restored industrial capacity. Former enemies we encouraged democratic institutions here. We integrated them into global trade. They became an economic competitor. Russia, we helped out. They're an economic competitor. We do this for any nation. The Philippines eventually too. After we liberated them in World War II, we freed them. That's not traditional empire behavior. Most empires don't create their own competition. They do the exact opposite. Just look at the precedent set before us here. The Navy and open seas, another important continuity from FDR's vision. The U.S. Navy became the guarantor of global sea lane security, not for American ships only, for everyone. Since 1945, the world economy runs on maritime trade, open access. About roughly 90% of all global piracy operations move by sea. Navy benefits Europe more than it benefits the United States by keeping free trade routes open. I mean, that's a benefit to the world provided by the United States Navy. When you see that Navy ship, that enforcement isn't altruism. It benefits the U.S. heavily. Keep in mind, FDR wanted the world to collectively protect the seas. But it's not a closed imperial sea system either. It is open. Anyone can use it. It is not just our collective. It is our global collective. And our current geopolitical reality is everyone gets to use it. People that are our adversaries included. And that's a massive structural difference from the European mercantilism. So what was FDR building? FDR wasn't trying to eliminate power politics. He was trying to shift the model. Instead of territorial empire, build a rules-based economic system anchored to the US dollar, open trade, and multilateral institutions. Sea lane security. You don't conquer territory. You shape the system. And here's the nuisance. That is still a form of dominance, just not a traditional colonial one. Was this a good mark if we are going to be an American empire for us to leave on the world? I mean, just say it. We're an empire. Answer in the comments. You know, it's my opinion. We're definitely an empire. Let's not argue it. Bretton Woods. Empire through architecture here. In 1944, while the war was still raging, 44 nations met at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire.
When you think of business and finance, you normally think of major cities across the globe. But did you know how a small town in New Hampshire is actually the birthplace of our global financial world order? It's July 1944, 1 month after D-Day, in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, where 44 allied nations gathered to plan the post-war economic order. From this conference emerged the Bretton Woods Agreement. Its main outcome? The establishment of the US dollar as the global reserve currency and the creation of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. These changes intended to bring stability during a much-needed time, promoting international trade, economic growth, and financial cooperation. Although the Bretton Woods system eventually ended when the US abandoned the gold standard, its influence still resonates throughout the financial world today. So the next time you go to exchange currency for international travel, remember that the exchange routes trace back to a meeting in a small town in New Hampshire.
The dollar becomes a reserve currency. Currencies pegged to the dollar. The dollar is convertible to gold. The IMF and World Bank are created. This did three huge things. One, it stabilized exchange rates. Two, it made reconstruction possible. I mean, think about World War II here. It was destruction on an unseen scale, financially, materially. It centered global finance around the United States. And that's not empire by flag. That is a empire by architecture. It is a soft power. And here's the irony. It dismantled British imperial trade blocs. Britain was financially exhausted after the war. When the U.S. extended post-war loans, conditions required currency convertibility and the end of imperial and preference systems. India ended up becoming free with U.S. support. I covered this in a prior video. India. U.S. support was not accidental for India. The United States had zero historical incentive to defend British rule in India. India didn't threaten America. India didn't compete with American trade. India was hostile. They were being Gandhi was leading their freedom movement to anything but hostile. What India represented was everything America opposed: a forced trade, colonial extraction, political subjugation, closed imperial markets. So US policy toward India, it wasn't charity, it was an ideological consistency. The old colonial model couldn't survive inside the new dollar-centered system. The British Empire didn't collapse from invasion. It collapsed under financial gravity. So the real debate isn't whether America became powerful. The real debate is, did America build a system where others could rise inside it, or one where others were trapped beneath it? Because here's what's undeniable. Germany rose again. Japan rose again. Western Europe recovered. That doesn't happen under a pure extraction empire. Let me know what you think. Now here's where it gets complicated. While FDR's system leaned heavily on economic integration, security concerns were already rising. The Soviet Union was expanding influence across Eastern Europe. Stalin was not building an open economic order here, so let's not confuse this. He was building a sphere, something that might have resembled a traditional empire. I guess the revolution never got rid of that oligarch way of thinking, but it was now ideological. So once again, let me know what you think. Because this is where the fork in the road appears. FDR's model, integrate and stabilize through economics, post-FDR policy, increasingly countered through security and containment. We kept the dollar system, we kept the open seas, but the tone changed and the institutions changed. That's where Truman enters the picture. On April 12th, 1945, the most powerful man in the world died, and the post-war blueprint died with him. Harry Truman had been vice president for only 82 days. He had not been deeply involved in Roosevelt's diplomatic strategy. He had not attended the major wartime summits. He had not shaped Bretton Woods. But within months, the tone of American power shifted. We essentially had a leader who is hardly in the inner circle of the post-war design, now leading it from a Western perspective. Keep in mind, America emerged as the world leader as far as the West was concerned. Everyone was looking at us. And this is pivotal in everything that happens for the next 80 years here, leading all the way up to now in our current geopolitical moment. It shaped the way Americans look at their country. It shaped the way the world looks at us. It shaped how Americans look at themselves. And this is where it gets real deep with us. From architect to enforcer. Roosevelt's approach leaned toward great power management through economic structure. Truman inherited a different moment. The Red Army occupied Eastern Europe. Germany was collapsing. The atomic bomb was nearing completion. Truman was thrust into a world that felt less like designing peace and more like preventing expansion. The first visible sign of the shift? The use of the atomic bomb against Japan. Keep in mind, Dwight Eisenhower was against the use of this, saying we didn't need to. Whatever one's moral position, it sent a message. America now possessed overwhelming military power, and it was willing to use it. That changed the psychological and geopolitical climate immediately. The use of the atomic bomb, I don't think anyone will argue, changed the entire world forever. The Truman Doctrine, let's see if something sounds familiar. In 1947, Truman delivered a speech that formalized a new framework. The Truman Doctrine pledged U.S. support to nations resisting communist expansion, beginning with Greece and Turkey. And by support, I mean with American military equipment if necessary. The economic system built for World War II was planned to stick around. FDR planned to wind down our military after the war. Let that sink in a moment. Go back to a traditional American value. Have a small standing army. Our Navy would have remained big, so reminder, do not touch our fucking boats.
We don't care what you look like. We don't care who you voted for, who you worship, what you worship, who you love. It doesn't matter if your dad left you millions when he died or if you knew who your father was. We have been honed into a machine of lethal moving parts that you would be wise to avoid if you know what's good for you. We will not be intimidated. We will not back down. We've seen war. We don't want war. But if you want war with the United States of America, there's one thing I can promise you, so help me God. Someone else will raise your sons and daughters.
Like, do not touch our fucking boats, please. This was the birth of containment. Not rebuild and integrate, but prevent and counter. The rhetoric hardened into ideological struggle. The world was divided into camps. This is the geopolitical reality, and it still resembles today's divide. Because once you define the conflict as existential ideology, everything becomes security policy. Also in 1947, Congress passed the National Security Act. This created the Department of Defense, former Department of War, the CIA, the National Security Council. This was not a temporary wartime structure. It was permanent. For the first time in American history, the United States institutionalized a standing peacetime national security apparatus. This was huge, and it goes against some fundamental American culture. Defense budgets that might have shrunk after 1945 instead stabilized at high levels. The military became embedded in policymaking. Eisenhower would later warn about the military-industrial complex. A general, a man who headed the military, warned us. The foundations were laid right here. Programs that contradicted FDR's vision. FDR's idea leaned heavily on economic integration, open trade, and reducing the incentives for war. But early Cold War policy increasingly relied on covert operations and hard containment. Our prime examples here: CIA involvement in Iran, 1953, Operation Ajax. We removed the prime minister, elected, Mohammed Mossadegh, after oil nationalization disputes. This is literally impacting a current event right now going on in Iran, ladies and gentlemen. Guatemala, 1954. U.S.-backed coup against Jacob Arbenz. Amid Cold War fears. Expanded nuclear arsenal under NSC 68, 1950, which recommended massive military buildup. These actions were justified within containment logic. But they moved from the idea of letting open economic systems win through prosperity. Instead of allowing ideological competition to play out organically, the U.S. increasingly intervened to shape outcomes. And that's a major philosophical and ideological shift. Let's be very clear here. Stalin was expanding. That is a reality not up to debate. The Soviet Union did not behave like a benign partner here. Soviet consolidated control over Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany. Opposition parties were suppressed. That is why these countries currently have strong militaries, because they've literally been colonized. I'm going to have to do a video on that one of these times, just on that entire region. It is nuts. I have ancestors from that region, and after World War II, in an area that was once called Prussia, now in Russia, a lot of them disappeared, Russian style. And if enough people ask, I'll share and read some of these letters. So back to where we were. Independent political systems were dismantled, and we cannot talk about this era without acknowledging Stalin's earlier crimes. The Holodomor, 1932 to 1933. Forced grain requisition policies during collectivization killed millions in Ukraine. The memory of that famine is not abstract in Ukrainian political culture. When modern Ukrainians resist Moscow, that resistance is rooted in generational memory. Oh, gee, something else currently happening in today's world. And during the Cold War, Many Eastern Europeans viewed the Red Army not as liberators, but as occupiers. Poland, congratulations on your nice, strong military. You, as the Polish, do understand the fight that we have been fighting all along. Something many of our Western friends have forgotten. My own country has forgotten in some sense. So containment didn't arise in vacuum. There was real fear. Look at what's going on in the world. But here's the big shift. Roosevelt's model focused on designing a world where prosperity undercut extremism. Truman's era built a world divided into armed camps. We kept Bretton Woods in 1970s. More went on with that. Another video, another time. But hello, current US dollar system. That runs the world currency. We kept open sea lanes. We rebuilt former enemies like Germany and Japan. We would have done the same for Russia, but I think even under Roosevelt, we would have been like, no, you're going a little too far. We are just going to lock you out of the free trade. We would have let our free trade system speak for itself. I mean, I don't know what speaks better, something that's free and open or something that's closed and uses whatever economic power they get to push their ideology. Let your system speak for itself. America's always done business with those who would later become our enemies here. Let me know what you think in the comments. But back to the history lesson. The U.S. also normalized permanent defense infrastructure, intelligence agencies conducting covert operations, nuclear arms race logic, ideological polarization. The United States went from architect integration to manager of standoff. The question isn't whether America should have opposed Stalin. The question is whether we allowed fear to permanently reshape our system into something Roosevelt never intended, because once the Cold War frame locked in, it never really went away. I mean, did it? Let me know. Hey, thank you for attending Aaron's Smoke Break for the direction of the American Empire, World War II Reconstruction. I will be picking up right where we left off here in a couple days. Please stay tuned. Thank you, and please like, subscribe, and share.